You think you're special, boy? Sheriff Wade Colton's voice bounced off the concrete walls of the holding cell with the ease of a man who had said those words before many times to many people and had never once been made to answer for them. He stood in the middle of the Oak Haven precinct with a pair of handcuffs dangling from one finger, swinging them in a lazy arc, his platinum blonde hair combed back under the brim of his sheriff's hat, his expression carrying that particular brand of satisfaction that only comes from a man who has confused authority with ownership. Inside the cell, a man sat on the metal bench with his hands resting on his knees, his back straight, his eyes focused somewhere past the wall in front of him, not because he wasn't paying attention, but because he had decided a long time ago that men like Colton were not worth the energy of a reaction. Colton leaned against the bars and laughed a low and comfortable sound, the laugh of a man entirely certain of the outcome. He told his deputy that they had themselves a drifter who forgot where he was. He said it like it was the punchline to a joke everyone already knew. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined as he stood there swinging those handcuffs, was that the man sitting in his cage was not a drifter. He was a retired command sergeant major, with 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and a list of decorations that reached all the way to the Pentagon. And the duffel bag that Colton had kicked carelessly into the corner of the booking room, the one he had dumped upside down on a dusty road an hour earlier, contained a silver star, a purple heart, and a citation for conspicuous gallantry signed by a 4-star general. The clock was already moving. A signal had already been sent. A black SUV was already merging onto the interstate 60 miles away, and in less than 3 hours, Sheriff Wade Colton would not be laughing. He would be standing in his own parking lot in his own handcuffs with cameras rolling and a federal agent reading him his rights. If you believe no badge gives any person the right to cage a man who bled for this country, join our channel right now, because what happens next is something every one of us needs to see. 6 hours earlier, the road had been exactly what Elijah Carter needed it to be, wide, quiet, and going somewhere worth going. He was 56 years old, built like a man the Army had assembled from the ground up, and then spent 3 decades stress testing. And while the gray at his temples and the stiff left knee told part of the story, they didn't tell all of it. The posture told the rest, the kind of uprightness that doesn't come from a gym or a drill instructor barking at you on a parade ground, but from 31 years of making decisions in places where the wrong call didn't give you the option of making another one. He had retired from the Army 2 years ago, and in those 2 years he had done exactly 3 things with any consistency. He had worked with his VA therapist, he had restored his car, and he had learned slowly and with significant effort how to sleep through the night. The car was a 1971 Ford Torino Deep Burgundy with black leather interior and an engine that spoke in a low, rolling rumble that Elijah had always found more honest than conversation. He had spent 3 years on that restoration, sourcing parts from 3 states, doing most of the work himself in the garage behind his house in Virginia, and his therapist had told him early on that rebuilding something with his hands was one of the best things he could do for a mind that had spent too long in survival mode. She had been right, as she usually was. The car was beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they have been broken and put back together with intention. He was on his way to Savannah to his daughter Naomi's wedding, which was happening in 2 days, and which he had been looking forward to for longer than he would admit to anyone. And he had taken the back roads through rural Georgia deliberately because the interstate felt like rushing and he was trying to practice not rushing. The fields rolled past on either side, gold and green under an afternoon sun that was hot but not punishing, and Elijah had the windows down and his large calloused hands easy on the wheel. On the back seat, a duffel bag held his clothes for the wedding, a shaving kit and a velvet-wrapped box. He never traveled without a box containing decorations he had never once displayed in his home, but always carried with him the way some people carry a photograph. On his wrist, a Breitling emergency watch caught the light as he turned the wheel, a retirement gift from his unit, modified by his private security firm with a silent distress beacon that he had never used and did not expect to use today. He did not know, as he drove through the golden Georgia afternoon, that he was already being watched. Sheriff Wade Colton had been parked behind the billboard for the better part of an hour, which was not unusual because Colton did not sit behind billboards to catch speeders. He sat behind billboards to watch, and waiting was something he had always been good at, in the way that patient predators are good at it, not from discipline, but from certainty. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set through the chest and shoulders in a way that had been muscle once, and was now something less defined, but no less imposing, and his platinum blonde hair graying at the roots, but kept neat-combed back in a deliberate sweep beneath the brim of his hat, gave him the look of a man who had always made an impression and knew it. His eyes behind the mirrored sunglasses were pale, and still the kind of still that isn't calm, but is a very good imitation of it, and he chewed gum with his jaw moving in a slow, methodical rhythm that was the only thing about him that ever seemed to be working. When Elijah's Torino came around the bend, Colton didn't reach for his radar gun. He didn't check the time. He watched the car roll past the deep burgundy paint catching the afternoon light, the engine speaking its low and confident note. And then he watched the driver, and something in the calculus of his mind, running the same calculation it had run 1,000 times, produced a number that he did not like. Car too fine. Driver too composed. Combination doesn't add up in the arithmetic of a man who has decided certain things belong to certain people. He put the cruiser in gear with the same unhurried ease with which he did everything, pulling onto the road without urgency because there was no urgency needed. He had been doing this for 20 years in Brackett County, following in the bootprints of his father, who had followed in the bootprints of his grandfather, and not one of the three of them had ever been made to account for what they did on these back roads on quiet afternoons. The county was not his responsibility. It was his inheritance, and he intended to protect it in the way men protect inheritances, not by improving them, but by keeping them exactly as they were. He hit his lights. Elijah saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite resignation, but lived somewhere between them, a heavy familiar recognition, the acknowledgement of a thing he had prepared for and hoped he wouldn't need to use. He checked his speedometer without moving his head 53 miles per hour in a 55 zone. He signaled immediately smooth and deliberate and guided the Torino onto the gravel shoulder with both hands steady on the wheel, killed the engine, and placed his large hands at 10 and 2 before the dust from the shoulder had finished settling. He had given this talk to his son 15 years ago, sitting across a kitchen table with the particular weight of a father who knows what he is describing is wrong and also knows that his child needs to hear it anyway, needs to carry it like a map through terrain that should not be as dangerous as it is. He had lived the talk himself in traffic stops in 3 different states in the careful economy of gesture and tone that black men learn to maintain in these moments, not because they are afraid, but because they are not willing to give someone a reason to make them afraid. Hands visible, voice calm, eyes forward. Don't explain more than you have to. Don't reach for anything without announcing it first. Colton took his time approaching another kind of power. The power of making someone wait in their own car and wonder, and stopped just behind the B-pillar, a tactical position that Elijah clocked immediately and filed away. The smell of stale tobacco and spearmint gum arrived before Colton's face appeared in the window, and Elijah looked straight ahead at the road and waited. Colton's first question was not about speed. It was not about registration. It was about the car, how a fella like Elijah came to be driving something like this, whether it was really his, what exactly he was doing moving through this part of Georgia on a Tuesday afternoon. Each question wearing the uniform of procedure, each one carrying something else underneath. Elijah answered each one in the same register, calm, direct, brief. Retired veteran. The title is in the glove box if you need it. Just passing through on the way to a family event. When Colton ordered him out of the vehicle, Elijah asked with the measured courtesy of a man who knows that asking is not the same as expecting what the legal basis was. Colton's hand moved to his holster with the ease of long practice. Elijah did the math in the space of one breath, argue, and risk not arriving anywhere at all. Comply, survive, and sort it out from the other side. He opened the door slowly and stepped out into the Georgia heat, and the two men stood on the gravel shoulder with the sun beating down between them, and Elijah was 2 inches taller, and that fact visible, undeniable, moved across Colton's face like a weather system. The pat-down was not about safety. The ankle kick that spread Elijah's stance was not about procedure. Elijah grunted once when the pain fired up his bad knee, a short involuntary sound, and then he found the breathing pattern in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and the pain receded to a manageable signal, and he did not buckle, and he did not give Colton the reactive satisfaction that Colton's hands were clearly looking for. Clean. Colton found nothing but a wallet and a phone. He moved to the car anyway, hand on the door handle, and Elijah stated clearly, and for the official record of his own composure, that he did not consent to a search of his vehicle. Colton said he smelled marijuana. Elijah said there was no marijuana in that car, and that he didn't smoke. Colton opened the door anyway. What came out of the Torino was not contraband. It was maps, a reusable water bottle, a bag of trail mix that split open when it hit the gravel, a road atlas with dog-eared pages, the contents of a man's careful journey scattered in the dirt. And then Colton's hand found the duffel bag on the back seat and pulled it free. Elijah's voice dropped exactly 1 register, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, the voice of a man communicating that a line is approaching. He said that bag contained personal property of significant value, and he would appreciate it being treated accordingly. Colton looked at him with the pale, still eyes of a man who has never found value in anything he didn't assign value to himself, and then he turned the duffel bag upside down and shook it over the road. Dress clothes, a shaving kit, and the velvet-wrapped box tumbling out last landing in the dust with a soft and terrible thud. Colton didn't open the box. He kicked the pile of clothes and said something about cluttering up his road, and Elijah looked at his belongings in the dust and said in a voice that had no temperature in it at all that he would like Colton to pick that up. Colton turned. The words landed between them like a dropped object. Elijah said it again. Not a request. That was the trigger. Colton's face went through several colors, and then he was behind Elijah with one arm wrenched up behind his back, inventing charges aloud as he applied the cuffs disorderly. Conduct, resisting arrest, threatening a peace officer, the charges assembling themselves in the air like a building being constructed over a hole. The cuffs went on too tight. Elijah felt the metal biting in and noted it for later. His head met the door frame of the cruiser on the way into the back seat. The contact slightly too deliberate to be an accident and slightly too deniable to be actionable, and then the door closed and the Georgia sun was on the other side of the glass, and Elijah was in the back of a county cruiser with his wrists aching and his knee throbbing and the velvet box somewhere in Colton's trunk. "You made a mistake," Sheriff Elijah said through the plexiglass divider, his voice carrying the particular quality of a statement rather than a provocation. Colton didn't answer. He was already humming something tuneless, pulling back onto the road, and the Torino sat on the gravel shoulder behind them, locked and gleaming in the afternoon light, waiting. The Brackett County Sheriff's Station was a brick building that looked like it had been assembled in 1973, and then simply maintained, not improved, not updated, just maintained the way you maintain something you have no intention of changing. The fluorescent lights in the booking area buzzed with a frequency that Elijah's ears registered immediately and filed under things that would become annoying quickly, and the smell was burnt coffee and old paperwork, and underneath both of those the particular institutional odor of a place that processes people rather than serves them. Colton brought him through the front door with his hand on Elijah's arm, narrating the charges to the room in the cheerful proprietorial tone of a man presenting a find, and the two people at the front desk received this presentation with different degrees of discomfort. Deputy Ray Hines was in his early 30s, 2 years on the job, with the look of a man who had learned that the space between what he believed was right and what he was willing to say about it was best navigated in silence. He looked at Elijah and then looked at his desk and then looked at a point in the middle distance that required his full attention. Sergeant Dora Pringle was in her late 50s, slow and unhurried in her movements, the institutional memory of a station that had been running the same way for a long time, and she looked at Elijah with the flat, measured gaze of someone who had seen this before and told herself it wasn't her business. The booking process moved through its stages. Fingerprints, photograph, the instruction to empty his pockets, and Elijah moved through it without expression, without protest, storing his energy the way a careful man stores supplies. He requested his phone call at the front desk. Colton overrode it. He told Pringle to look at the military ID behind his driver's license. Colton took the wallet before Pringle's hand reached it, dropped it in an evidence bag without opening it, and moved on. In the waiting area near the booking desk, a boy of about 10 sat alone on a plastic chair with a backpack in his lap and both feet flat on the floor. The posture of a child who has learned that the way to be safe in uncertain places is to take up as little space as possible. His name was Noah. His mother was in one of the back cells on a charge that had been manufactured with the same casual ease with which Colton manufactured all of his charges. Noah had been sitting in that waiting room for 2 hours. When they walked, Elijah past Noah, looked up, and Elijah in the middle of all of it, the cuffs and the charges and the noise of the station, looked back and held the boy's gaze for a moment with an expression that said, without words, that he saw him. Noah did not look away. He was the only person in that building who met Elijah's eyes with something other than pity or contempt. He met them with recognition, the recognition of someone who understood at 10 years old exactly what was happening in that room and exactly why it was wrong. The cell was a concrete box, windowless, smelling of industrial bleach, that hadn't quite covered what was underneath it, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a drain in the floor that had seen better years. Colton removed the cuffs at the door, one last twist of the wrist, brief and purposeful, and told Elijah with the particular pleasure of a man who has saved the best part for last that the judge was out fishing and wouldn't be back until Tuesday, which meant Elijah had himself a long weekend to think about his attitude. The iron door closed. The lock clicked. Colton's footsteps moved down the corridor and faded, and the fluorescent hum of the station settled around Elijah like a frequency. He stood in the center of the cell for 30 seconds. Then he went to the bench and sat down, planted his feet, and began the breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. He was not panicking. He was analyzing running the situation the way he had run situations in places where the stakes were considerably higher than a county jail in rural Georgia, mapping the variables, identifying the leverage points, and arriving methodically at the same conclusion he had already reached. In the back of the cruiser, Colton's critical error was the watch. The Breitling emergency on his wrist had never been confiscated because Colton hadn't recognized it for what it was. It looked like an expensive watch, and expensive watches on men Colton had already decided he owned were things to be noted and resented, not investigated. Elijah turned his wrist slowly, found the safety cap on the side of the case, and unscrewed it with 2 fingers. He pulled the antenna a movement so small it was invisible from more than 2 feet away and held it for 3 seconds. A silent signal fired upward to a satellite relay bounced down to a secure server in Arlington, Virginia, and generated an alert on 3 phones simultaneously. Code black. Unlawful detainment. Location confirmed. He replaced the cap and folded his hands and waited with the patience of a man who has learned that the hardest battles are the ones you have to win slowly. A sound, soft, deliberate, and a folded piece of paper appeared at the bottom of the cell door, pushed through the narrow gap with the careful precision of someone who had thought about the angle beforehand. Elijah leaned forward, picked it up, and unfolded it. The handwriting was a child's uneven block letters pressed hard into the paper, as if the importance of the message required physical emphasis. It said, "I saw what he did to your bag. My mom is in here too." Elijah read it twice. Then he sat back on the bench, and something shifted in the geometry of what he intended to do. He had been going to survive this get-out move on arrive in Savannah in time to straighten his tie before his daughter walked down the aisle. He was still going to do all of those things. But he was not. He decided in that moment going to do only those things. Because there was a 10-year-old boy on the other side of that door who had been sitting in a police station for 2 hours waiting for his mother, and that was not something a man with Elijah's particular set of resources could know and then quietly leave behind. Back in the front office, Sheriff Wade Colton had his feet on his desk and Elijah's duffel bag in his lap, and he was going through it with the unhurried confidence of a man conducting a search that has already arrived at its conclusion, the only remaining task being the formal discovery of the evidence he has already decided is there. He found clothes first folded carefully, the kind of folded that speaks of habit and discipline, and went through them with both hands and found nothing. He found a shaving kit plain and functional and unzipped it and found exactly what a shaving kit contains. He found a toothbrush, a small tube of toothpaste, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a wedding venue confirmation in Savannah, and nothing else. His jaw moved steadily on his gum. He set the bag aside and reached back in, and his hand found the velvet-wrapped box. "Hey, Hines," Colton said, and his voice had the quality of a man who is about to be entertained. "Come look at this." He held the box up with 2 fingers, the way you hold something you find mildly interesting, and Deputy Hines crossed the room and stood beside him, and Colton pulled the velvet wrapping open with his thumb. The room went quiet in a way that rooms don't usually go quiet, not suddenly but incrementally, the ambient noise of the station seeming to drain away as the contents of the box came into view. Nestled in black satin arranged with a care that suggested they had been arranged this way many times over many years were medals. A silver star with an oak leaf cluster. A purple heart. A bronze star with a V device for valor. And beneath them, folded once along a precise crease, a document on official government letterhead. Pringle had been watching from her desk with the peripheral attention of a woman who notices things she doesn't always acknowledge, and now she stood up and crossed the room and took the document from the box before Colton could stop her, or rather, before it occurred to him to stop her, because his mind was still processing the medals and hadn't gotten to the document yet. She unfolded it carefully, smoothed it against her palm, and began reading. Her face did not change all at once. It changed in layers the way ice changes when the temperature shifts from the outside and starting at the edges of her expression and working toward the center, until what remained there was not a look that Elijah's colleagues would have recognized as Dora Pringle's usual flat composure, but something different. Something with fear in it, and the specific variety of fear that comes not from danger but from comprehension. She said very quietly that Colton needed to hear what she was about to tell him. She read the name on the citation. She read the rank Command Sergeant Major. She read the unit designation 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, and she explained in the plain and careful language of a woman who understands that she is now speaking for the record whether anyone is recording or not. That the V device on the bronze star stands for valor in direct combat with an armed enemy, and that the man currently sitting in Cell 3 without access to a phone call was not a drifter who had forgotten his place. He was one of the most decorated combat veterans in the United States Army. Hines had picked up the silver star and was holding it with both hands the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and that you understand fully you have no right to be touching. He looked at Colton. Colton looked at the medals. The smirk was still on his face, but it had gone structural. The kind of expression that stays on a face after the feeling behind it has left held in place by muscle memory and the refusal to acknowledge what the rest of the body already knows. The phone rang. It was the loudest sound in the room. Colton picked it up. The voice on the other end did not introduce itself with pleasantries or preamble. It identified itself as General Harlan Beckett, commander of United States Army Special Operations Command, calling from the Pentagon, and it informed Sheriff Wade Colton of Brackett County, Georgia, in a register so precisely controlled that the temperature of it made the air in the room feel different. That he had 30 minutes. 30 minutes to have Command Sergeant Major Elijah Carter sitting in the front lobby of his station with his personal effects fully returned before legal counsel arrived from Atlanta, after which the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the IRS would begin a coordinated investigation into the Brackett County Sheriff's Department that would not end quickly and would not end well. The line went dead. Colton set the phone down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment, and Deputy Hines watched him, and Sergeant Pringle watched him, and for the first time in the collective memory of everyone in that building, the sheriff of Brackett County looked like a small man standing in a large room. Colton told them he was handling it, and went out the back door into the hard afternoon sun of the impound lot, and the way he moved fast, purposeful. The walk of a man going somewhere with a plan was the walk of a man who does not yet have a plan, and is hoping the motion will produce one. He went to the Torino first, circling it once with his hands on his hips, and then he started going through it trunk first, which held a spare tire and a jack, and nothing else. Then the interior, pulling up floor mats, running his hands under the seats, checking the sun visors and the glove box and the gap behind the back seat cushion. The car was immaculate in a way that reflected the 3 years Elijah had put into it. Every surface clean, every component in its place. The interior smelling faintly of leather conditioner and old road maps, and nothing that wasn't supposed to be there. Desperation is a specific sensation, and Colton knew it the way you know a recurring pain, not fondly, but familiarly. He put his hand into his shirt pocket and found the small evidence bag that lived there, the one containing a few grams of methamphetamine that had been confiscated from a trucker 6 weeks ago and never once appeared in an evidence log. It was his insurance, the kind of policy you take out when you've been operating long enough to know that you occasionally need to create facts rather than find them. He leaned into the open passenger door of the Torino, his hand moving toward the footwell. "Afternoon, Wade." The voice came from the chain-link fence at the edge of the lot, and Colton straightened so fast his back protested. On the public sidewalk on the other side of the fence, Mr. Dellums, the retired postmaster, a man in his 70s with a beagle on a leash and the unhurried manner of someone who has nowhere pressing to be, stood watching him with an expression that was not accusatory or alarmed, but was undeniably attentive. He said Colton looked like he was working hard for a simple search. He said his son-in-law worked for the state attorney general's office, mentioned it the way you mention the weather, and began walking the beagle down the sidewalk without waiting for a response. Colton pushed the bag back into his pocket. He could not plant it now. He kicked the Torino's rear tire, scuffed the white wall, and went back inside. Pringle was at her desk when he came back in, and the look on her face was the look of someone who has been waiting for him specifically, and has not been using the time to feel better about things. She turned her monitor so he could see the screen. An email from the county commissioner formally requesting an update on the situation involving a Sergeant Major Carter, noting that the governor's office had placed a call to the commissioner's cell phone within the past 40 minutes. She had also, she told him, run the VIN on the Torino, as he had originally asked her to, and the results had arrived while he was in the impound lot. The car was not stolen. It was registered jointly to Elijah Carter and to a holding company called Aegis Strategic Solutions, a private military contracting firm with federal contracts valued in the billions with 4 sitting senators on its advisory board and a legal department that Pringle said, with the flat delivery of a woman reading a weather report, employed more attorneys than the entire state of Georgia's public defender network. Colton sat down in the nearest chair, and while he sat there absorbing the architecture of the position he had put himself in 40 miles away on a state highway, a driver who had slowed down to watch the roadside stop that afternoon finished uploading a 47-second video to social media. The footage was shot through a car window at a distance slightly blurred but clear enough to show what mattered: a man's dress clothes scattered in the gravel, a velvet box upended in the dust, and a uniformed sheriff watching it with his arms crossed and his gum working steadily in his jaw. The caption read, "Pulled over in Brackett County." The bag he dumped on the road had military medals in it. The video had 40,000 views before Colton's cruiser made it back to the station. It had 400,000 views by the time Pringle showed him the commissioner's email. The comments were not favorable. He had Elijah brought to the interrogation room, the windowless box with the metal table and the one-way mirror, and told Hines to kill the recording system before he closed the door. He wanted no witnesses for this part. He sat across from Elijah in the way men sit when they are trying to look relaxed, and the effort of it is visible, and he put a single sheet of paper on the table between them and began talking in the tone of a man proposing something reasonable. He said they had gotten off on the wrong foot. He said it was hot out, tempers flare. These things happen. He said he was willing to drop every charge, forget the whole afternoon, let Elijah walk out the front door right now in time to make his daughter's wedding, and all it required was a signature on the paper, a standard release of liability. He said, just acknowledging that Elijah had been treated appropriately and had no complaints against the department. Elijah looked at the paper for a long moment and then looked at Colton, and his expression was the expression of a man who is not angry, which was in some ways more unsettling than anger would have been because it meant Elijah was operating from a position he hadn't told Colton about yet. He declined, and he explained why, and the explanation was precise enough that Colton's face moved through several distinct stages of comprehension as he received it. Colton was not offering Elijah an exit. He was looking for one himself. He had kicked a sleeping bear, as Elijah put it, and was now hoping to pet it back to sleep, but it was too late for that. Then Elijah lifted his wrist and mentioned the watch and told Colton in the same level and unhurried register he had used for everything that the audio of their current conversation had been transmitting to a cloud server for the past 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Colton stared at the brightling. He looked like a man watching a wall he thought was solid develop a crack. The commotion outside the interrogation room door arrived before the door opened. Pringle's voice elevated in the particular register of someone trying to manage a situation that has already moved past the point of being managed, and then another voice underneath it, low and unhurried and carrying the unmistakable resonance of a man who has been in more rooms like this than the people currently attempting to manage him have had professional experience. The door opened. The man who walked through it was tall, with silver hair swept back from a face that had the sharpened quality of someone who spent most of his time in environments where being imprecise was expensive. Rimless glasses, a bespoke charcoal suit that occupied a price range significantly above what the Brackett County property tax base could readily imagine, and in his right hand, held with the casual certainty of a man carrying a tool, he knows how to use a leather briefcase and a federal court order. Harrison Blackwood did not look at Colton when he entered. He looked at Elijah and said with the crisp efficiency of a man who apologizes precisely once and means it that he was sorry for the delay and that traffic on the interstate had been genuinely dreadful. Then he laid the court order on the table directly on top of Colton's liability waiver. A writ of habeas corpus signed by a federal district judge in Atlanta 22 minutes ago demanding the immediate release of his client and the preservation of all evidence, specifically including dash cam footage, body cam footage, booking records, and station security logs. He set his briefcase down and opened it and produced a phone, and he began documenting the red welts on Elijah's wrists where the cuffs had been applied too tightly, photographing them from 3 angles with the methodical efficiency of a man who understands that evidence is built in increments. As he worked, he spoke not to Colton directly, but in the way that lawyers sometimes speak when they want to ensure their words are registered by everyone in a room, citing the applicable legal standards. Civil rights violation under Section 1983 of the United States Code. Unlawful imprisonment assault causing bodily harm. He paused and looked at the liability waiver still visible beneath the court order, and a particular quality entered his voice, something that was not quite amusement, but in the same neighborhood. He asked Colton with the phrasing of a man who already knows the answer and wants the room to hear the question whether the sheriff had in fact attempted to have a detained veteran sign away his civil rights without legal counsel present. He said it the way you say something you intend to quote later. Colton was against the wall in both the literal and figurative sense, and Blackwood directed Hines, not Colton, to remove the cuffs, and Hines moved immediately with the speed of a man grateful for a clear instruction, and the cuffs came off, and Elijah rubbed his wrists slowly as Pringle, watching from the doorway, turned back to her desk and began printing the complete arrest log in full. Blackwood mentioned almost parenthetically that he had noticed a Channel 7 news van in the parking lot on his way in, a reporter in a blazer camera crew setting up the particular organized urgency of a local news team that has received a tip and believes it. Colton moved to the window. The van was there, the reporter already on her phone, the camera on a tripod pointed at the station entrance. He looked at the parking lot and beyond the van at the impound area at his cruiser. The dash cam footage. Everything that had happened on that gravel shoulder on the way into town was still on the hard drive in his cruiser. The stop, the metals on the road, the ankle kick, the invented probable cause, all of it preserved with the dispassionate completeness of a recording system that did not understand what it was seeing and documented it faithfully regardless. If that footage reached a prosecutor or a judge or a reporter with a camera pointed at the station entrance, the liability waiver on the table was the least of his problems. He went out the back door. He crossed the impound lot to his cruiser. He got in, started the engine, and threw it in reverse, and the rear of the vehicle had moved approximately 4 feet when a black SUV came around the corner of the building and stopped directly behind him, and 2 men in tactical gear stepped out with weapons at the low ready, and the letters on the back of their vests were yellow and very clear, and they said FBI. He looked forward. A second SUV sat at the front gate of the impound lot, blocking the exit. He looked at the roof of the station, a position up there, one of their people still observing. Wade Colton opened the cruiser door. He placed both hands on the roof and stood in the Georgia afternoon sun in the parking lot of the station his grandfather had built in the county his family had run for 3 generations, and felt the specific structural collapse of a certainty that had held him upright for his entire adult life. The bubble of absolute authority that had surrounded him for 20 years did not pop dramatically. It just went away quietly, like a sound that stops and leaves behind a silence that is somehow louder than the noise was. Special Agent Dana Reeves approached with her weapon at the low ready, and her voice at a register that contained no excess of anything, no drama, no anger, no satisfaction, just the clean, procedural language of a federal officer doing her job in a county she had been briefed on and had formed opinions about before she arrived. She directed Colton to turn around. She directed him to keep his hands where she could see them. She applied the cuffs with a professionalism that was in its own way a statement. The same hardware, the same position. Nothing theatrical about it, just the proper and lawful application of a restraint that Colton had applied to thousands of people across 20 years and had never once expected to feel from the other side. Elijah had come out of the station. He stood near the entrance with Blackwood beside him, and he watched the scene with the composed and slightly distant attention of a senior officer observing an operation that is proceeding as planned, present, aware, and essentially unmoved. The Channel 7 reporter moved toward Colton immediately, microphone extended questions arriving in rapid succession about the decorated veteran, about the Department of Justice, about the files being seized from the station's records room. And Colton ducked his head and the camera caught it anyway, and that footage would be on the 6 o'clock news in 3 states. They walked him past Elijah. Colton stopped, dug his heels in for just a moment, one last gesture of the authority he had spent his life accumulating, and looked up at the man he had thrown in a cage that afternoon, and told him in a voice that had lost all of its former register, and was now just the voice of a frightened person, that he had a family, and he was asking Elijah, please, not to let them ruin him. Elijah looked at him for a long moment before he answered. There was no anger in the look. There was something that was harder to receive than anger, which was the simple and total absence of surprise. He told Colton that he had a family when he pulled him over on a road he wasn't speeding on. He had a family when he kicked a man's military decorations into the dirt. He had a family when he stood in a parking lot with a bag of meth in his hand looking for a blind spot. He told him that a badge is a weight, and it is meant to be used in one specific direction toward the protection of people who need it, and that Colton had spent 20 years pointing it the other way, and that was not something Elijah had done to him. He stepped back. Reeves moved Colton into the federal vehicle. In the doorway of the station, Deputy Ray Hines stood watching. He was holding the hard drive from Colton's cruiser in both hands, having gone to retrieve it from the vehicle before anyone asked him to carrying it across the parking lot to hand to Agent Reeves personally. Pringle told Hines to hand it directly to Reeves and to document the transfer with his own body camera running. She was cooperating fully and completely, and she wanted that on record. And she said it in the flat and declarative tone of a woman who has made a decision she should have made a long time ago and intends to follow through on it cleanly. Hines crossed the parking lot and handed the drive to Reeves and said quietly that she should also know about the body cam footage from his own unit, that he had kept the recording running through the booking process, which was procedure, and that the footage existed and was intact and was hers if she needed it. Reeves looked at him for a moment and wrote something in her notes and thanked him. On his way back into the station, Hines passed Elijah standing near the entrance. He stopped. There was a moment where the two men were simply standing on the same piece of ground, and Hines extended his hand, and Elijah looked at it, one beat, two, and then took it. They shook hands once firmly, and then Hines went inside, and Elijah stood in the parking lot with the afternoon sun moving toward the tree line, and something settled in him that had been unsettled since the gravel shoulder. He turned to Blackwood and said that today was not an isolated incident, that a man doesn't walk around with a pre-packaged evidence bag unless he has used it before and expects to need it again, which means there are people who were not as fortunate as Elijah sitting in cells or carrying records they shouldn't have. Blackwood nodded and said he would make sure Reeves heard it. Elijah walked toward the agent himself. He laid out his analysis in the clean, sequential language of a man who has spent his career briefing complicated situations to people who needed to act on them quickly. Colton had moved toward that cruiser, not just to destroy the footage of the traffic stop, but to protect something else that was on it or near it, something that represented a larger exposure. He suggested Reeves look specifically for a secondary evidence log, an off-book storage system, and financial records that don't match a county sheriff's salary. Reeves was already writing. And then, near the edge of the parking lot in the late afternoon light that had gone from hard to soft while no one was paying attention to it, Noah appeared. He was holding his mother's hand. She had been quietly released from the back cell by a deputy who had reassessed the situation upon the arrival of federal agents and found the charges to be upon reflection unsupportable, and they were standing together at the edge of the lot, and the boy was looking at Elijah. Elijah caught his eye across the parking lot. He nodded once, not the nod of a superior to a subordinate, but the nod of one person to another who has seen something true and survived it. Noah nodded back with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what the gesture meant. It was the most important thing that happened in that parking lot. In the weeks that followed, Brackett County went through the kind of reckoning that small places go through when the thing that has been keeping them stable turns out to have been holding them down, a disorienting, painful, and ultimately necessary process that moved faster than anyone expected, because the video had already done so much of the work. The footage of Elijah's medals in the gravel reached 4 million views within the first 72 hours, carried across platforms by a combination of outrage and something harder to quantify, the particular viral momentum of an image that people recognize as wrong in a way that doesn't require explanation. Every major network ran it. Opinion pieces appeared in publications that normally did not cover rural Georgia. A congressman from Maryland mentioned it on the floor of the House, not as a speech, but as an aside. The kind of aside that signals something has entered the national conversation through a door that doesn't close easily. The FBI hotline established within 48 hours of the arrest received 314 calls in its first week. What poured in were not stories, they were receipts. A single mother named Bernadette, who had been charged with a traffic violation that didn't exist, and paid $400 in cash to a deputy who showed up at her workplace because Colton's office had told her that was how fines were handled in Brackett County. A 23-year-old named Darius, whose truck had been seized under asset forfeiture after a traffic stop and auctioned within 90 days by a company belonging to Colton's brother-in-law at a price that was 30% of its value. Migrant workers from 3 different farms who had been detained on rotations timed to payday and released after their wages were confiscated as supposed evidence in investigations that were never filed. A family whose home had been searched without a warrant after they filed a noise complaint against a man who turned out to be a Colton associate. And then the dash cam footage from Colton's cruiser reached the prosecutors, and the scope of the thing expanded in a direction that even Elijah with his analyst's mind had not fully anticipated. The footage captured the stop and everything. It contained the ankle kick, the medals, the manufactured probable cause, but it also captured what happened after Colton put Elijah in the back seat and sat behind the wheel and made a phone call. The audio inside the cruiser recorded his side of it clearly. He was calling a man named Devin Marsh. He told Marsh he had a problem, a civilian who might bring heat, and he needed the shipment moved out of the impound lot's blue storage locker that night before anyone came looking. The FBI raided the locker within 6 hours of receiving the footage. They found 8 kilograms of methamphetamine. A ledger written in a personal shorthand that a forensic accountant decoded in 4 days, and a paper trail connecting 7 years of confiscations seized from low-level dealers during traffic stops that were never logged to sales through Marsh's distribution network, with the proceeds moving through 3 shell entities before arriving in accounts that paid for Colton's house in the mountains, his boat, and his brother-in-law's real estate company. He had not been protecting the county. He had been running it like a private toll road, and the badge was the toll. Deputy Ray Hines sat across from 2 federal investigators in a conference room in Atlanta and told them everything he knew, which turned out to be more than he had realized he knew until he started talking. He described the 2 incidents from the previous year that he had witnessed and not reported, once a cash withdrawal from a driver's wallet during a booking process that never appeared in the evidence log, and once a sealed bag of confiscated material that Colton had removed from the property room on a Sunday afternoon and signed out under a case number that Hines had later looked up and found assigned to a case that had been closed the previous spring. He had told himself at the time that he didn't have enough to be certain which was true, and also that he wasn't in a position to take it further, which was less true, and which he knew it. He said that to the investigators plainly, without minimizing it in the way that a person speaks when they have decided to be honest about something that doesn't reflect well on them, because the alternative is worse. His testimony was corroborated by the hotline calls, the ledger, and the body cam footage he had preserved from the booking process. The U.S. Attorney's Office granted him cooperation status, and a notation in the filed indictment acknowledged that his voluntary evidence preservation, retrieving the hard drive from Colton's cruiser before it was requested and delivering it directly to the FBI, had been a decisive factor in securing the chain of custody for the prosecution's central exhibit. He was not charged. He was not celebrated either, which was probably appropriate because what he had done was the floor of what a person in his position should do, and both he and the investigators understood that. But he had done it when it mattered, which was the only time it counted. Sergeant Dora Pringle retired within the month, full pension. 31 years of service, a retirement party attended by most of the station's staff who managed to make the event feel warm despite the circumstances, because Pringle herself had always been fair in the ways that counted, even when she hadn't been brave. The interim sheriff appointed by the county commissioner came from outside Brackett County, a woman named Sheriff Adrian Moss, with a forensic accounting background and a reputation in her previous county for the kind of scrupulous evidence handling that made defense attorneys' lives significantly more difficult. Her first official act was ordering a complete audit of every arrest, every evidence log, and every asset seizure from the past 10 years. Elijah went home to Virginia. His knee was worse from the concrete of the cell. He didn't mention it to anyone, because it was the kind of thing he processed privately and then moved past, and he sat at his kitchen table 2 evenings after the trial and read a letter from the Federal Subcommittee on Civil Rights Enforcement, requesting his consultation in developing mandatory training standards for law enforcement interactions with veterans in rural jurisdictions. He sat with it for 2 days. He read it 3 times. Then he called Blackwood and said he would do it on one condition: that any compensation from his involvement stipends. Speaking fees, consultant payments go directly to a legal defense fund for veterans who had been wrongfully treated by law enforcement but didn't happen to have a 4-star general's private number saved in their watch. Blackwood said yes before Elijah finished the sentence. He started to name the fund after Elijah. Elijah told him to name it something that belonged to more people than him. They settled on the Open Road Initiative and left it at that. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was full on the morning of the trial, in a way that courtrooms are full when a case has become something larger than a case when it has become in the public imagination a referendum on something people have been arguing about in different forms for a long time and have never fully resolved. The gallery was organized in the particular way that galleries organize themselves around causes media in one section, advocates in another, and in 3 rows near the back. 17 of Colton's identified victims sitting together with the quiet solidarity of people who have been told their experiences were not real and have been waiting for a room that would treat them as evidence. Elijah sat in the front row in a navy suit, the Breitling on his wrist, his hands resting on his knees in the same position they had been in when he pulled onto that gravel shoulder 3 months ago. Calm, deliberate, the posture of a man who has decided how he is going to conduct himself in a given environment and does not require the environment to validate the decision. 2 seats to his right, General Harlan Beckett sat with his arms folded and his expression set to an angle that communicated without requiring words that he had not flown to Atlanta because he was subpoenaed. He had come because he wanted Wade Colton to see him there. U.S. Attorney Elena Rosario opened without theatrics. She was known in federal legal circles for the particular effectiveness of her approach, which was to treat the evidence with the same respect that she expected juries to bring to it, presenting it cleanly, sequentially, and completely without embellishment, on the understanding that juries respond to being treated as intelligent. She walked them through the stop, the speed data from the cruiser's own telemetry confirming 53 miles per hour, the timeline of the search, the body cam footage from Hines' unit showing the booking process in full, the photographs of Elijah's wrists. Then she played the dash cam footage. She played it once, beginning to end, without narration, and the courtroom watched in a silence that had quality to it, the quality of people absorbing something they will not forget easily, and heard Colton's voice describing a man he had just put in a cage. The word drifter sitting in the air of the courtroom with the weight of everything it was intended to carry. She let the tape run. The phone call to Devin Marsh played in full, the instruction to move the shipment from the blue locker, the acknowledgement in Colton's own voice of a distribution arrangement that had been running for 7 years through a man the FBI had been monitoring for drug trafficking since before Elijah Carter had ever set foot in Brackett County. Rosario paused the recording and turned to the jury and said simply that this was not a momentary lapse. This was a man who had organized his county around his own enrichment and had used the authority entrusted to him by the public to protect the operation by eliminating inconveniences, and that on the afternoon in question, Elijah Carter had been identified as an inconvenience before Colton's cruiser had completed its U-turn on the back road. The defense had nothing that functioned as a counter to this. The attorney made the arguments available to him reasonable officer standard heat of the day escalating subject, and the jury had already watched the footage, and the arguments did not survive contact with what the footage contained. Colton took the stand and tried the framing one more time. He said he was doing his job. He said the county was safer because of the work he did. He said things had been taken out of context. Rosario played the phone call again, not because the jury had forgotten it, but because hearing it a second time in the silence of a federal courtroom with the man who made it sitting 5 feet away and looking at the floor made a different kind of impression than the first time had. The defense did not re-examine him. The jury deliberated for under 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights, under color of law, obstruction of justice, racketeering witness, tampering, drug trafficking. Judge Clarence Wortham addressed Colton before sentencing in the flat, unhurried register of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that speeches from the bench are most effective when they are not speeches. He said that Colton had not kept his county safe. He had held it hostage. He had taken a public trust and converted it into a private revenue stream, and along the way he had hurt a great number of people who had no recourse and no protection, because the protection was the threat. The gavel came down. 27 years. No parole. Full asset forfeiture for victim restitution. The marshals applied the handcuffs at the defense table, the same hardware in the same position, handled with the same professional dispassion, and walked Colton toward the side door. He looked back at Elijah as he went. Elijah held his gaze without moving, without expression, until the door closed and there was nothing left to look at. And then he looked at his hands in his lap and breathed out slowly. Outside on the courthouse steps, Blackwood spoke briefly to the assembled cameras and then stepped back, and Elijah stepped forward and said one thing directly and without preparation: that there were officers in every department in this country who did the job the way it was meant to be done, who came home every day having made their communities genuinely safer, and that those officers deserved a department that reflected their integrity, and that letting a Wade Colton run unchecked for 20 years was a failure that started long before the traffic stop, and that cleaning it up required everyone in the building to decide which side of the line they were on. He mentioned Hines by implication without naming him. He mentioned Noah's mother by implication without naming her. And then he walked down the steps into the Atlanta afternoon and didn't look at the cameras that followed him. 6 months after the trial, Savannah in the early evening had the particular quality that coastal southern cities have in the hours between afternoon and full dark, the air still warm but no longer insistent about it. The light gone golden and horizontal coming through the Spanish moss at an angle that made everything it touched look like it had always been this way, like the night and the warmth and the gardenias, and the string lights strung between the live oaks had been arranged here specifically and permanently. The venue was a garden open to the sky strung with warm light, the kind of place that had been chosen because Naomi had known exactly what she wanted and had the patience to find it, and the string quartet in the far corner was playing something that Elijah did not recognize, but that sounded to his ears like the audible version of arriving somewhere after a very long drive. He sat at the head table in a suit he had pressed himself that morning, the Breitling on his wrist, a glass of iced tea in front of him, watching his daughter dance with her new husband in the middle of the garden floor, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is present, not thinking about the next thing or processing the last thing, simply present in this specific garden on this specific evening, watching this specific person who is his daughter, and who is by any accounting radiant. A hand touched his arm, and he looked up, and Noah was standing beside the table. He was in a collared shirt that was slightly too formal for a 10-year-old and slightly too large in the shoulders, the kind of shirt that a child wears when an adult has made a decision about what the occasion requires, and the child has accepted this decision without much negotiation. His mother, Rosa, whose name Elijah now knew, whose manufactured charges had been among the first vacated by the DA's review, who had a job now and a clean record, and a two-bedroom apartment stood a few feet back, watching with the expression of a woman who is still not fully accustomed to good things happening without a catch. Noah held out a folded piece of paper. Both hands. The way you hand something to someone when you want to make sure they understand it matters. Elijah took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing in crayon, the particular confident inaccuracy of a 10-year-old who knows what he means to convey and trusts the drawing to carry it of a dark red car on an open road. Big wheels, the kind of racing stripes that appear in drawings of cool cars regardless of whether the actual car has them, and in the sky above the road a single star, large and yellow, positioned with the narrative certainty of a child who understands that stars belong above things that matter. Under the drawing in block letters that pressed hard enough into the paper to leave impressions on the back. The car that kept going. Elijah looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he folded it once along the crease Noah had made and put it in his breast pocket over his heart and pressed his hand flat against it once. He stood up. He picked up his glass and tapped it with a spoon, and the garden went quiet in the way gardens go quiet at weddings. The string quartet trailing off the conversations, pausing, the soft and collective attention of a gathering turning toward a single person. And Elijah looked at Naomi, who was looking back at him from the dance floor with an expression that he would remember for a long time, and he began to speak. He didn't talk about Brackett County. He didn't mention Colton or the cell or the gravel shoulder or the watch. He talked about the road, about how it is never entirely straight, and about how there are obstacles and people who try to stop you and tell you that you don't belong in the lane you're in, and about how you keep your hands on the wheel and you remember who you are, because the truth is, the only engine that never breaks down, and the only thing they can't confiscate no matter what they kick into the dirt. The garden applauded, and Naomi ran to him, and he held his daughter in the middle of the dance floor with the string lights above them and the gardenias in the air, and the sound of people who love each other being happy, and he did not think about Colton at all. United States versus Colton was cited in 2 law school curricula within the year, used as a case study in pattern-based civil rights abuse and the accountability gap that allows it to persist in jurisdictions where oversight is thin and tenure is long. The Brackett County audit uncovered 14 wrongful convictions connected to Colton's evidence tampering. All 14 were vacated, and the DA's office issued a formal public apology to each of the affected individuals by name. Devin Hines was retained as senior deputy under Sheriff Moss, the first person Colton had trained who, when the moment arrived, chose differently, and Rosa Noah's mother attended the first public hearing of the county's new Civilian Oversight Board and gave testimony that the board voted unanimously to include in the official record. The Open Road Initiative provided legal counsel to 19 veterans in its first operating year, resulting in 3 overturned convictions and 11 dropped charges. The federal training standards that Elijah consulted on were adopted by the Department of Justice as recommended guidelines for rural law enforcement. General Beckett, in a rare public statement that his office confirmed was his own language and no one else's, said that the Army produces people who run toward the things that everyone else is running from, and that this country owes it to those people to build the kind of justice they were promised when they raised their right hand. That night after the wedding, after the guests had gone, and the string lights were still on, and the gardenias still held their scent in the cooling air, Elijah drove the Torino home on the back roads, windows down, the engine running in its low and honest register, the drawing folded in his breast pocket and the Breitling on his wrist, and the road ahead long and dark and lit only by the headlights and the stars. He didn't think about Colton. He thought about Noah's drawing a red car on an open road, 1 star above it. The caption pressed hard into the paper by the hands of a boy who needed to believe that the car kept going. He thought about the road ahead, which was long and which was his, and which nobody was standing in the middle of anymore. He drove until the city lights were behind him, and there was nothing on either side but open country, And then he drove a little further still because the road was free and he was free, and there was no reason in the world to stop.